Good evening, everybody. My name is Charles Cadwell, and it's my job to welcome you to this evening's historic Chevy Chase DC Zoom event, the fifth in our series that we have titled Race Matters Locally. Tonight, we're talking about the Marquis de Lafayette and George Pointer, two men joined in ideology and soon to be joined in a neighborhood park here in Washington. I want to welcome back many of you who have participated in several of these events previously, and for those of you who are new, welcome indeed. Tonight's event is going to be recorded, and a video of the event will be put on our website, www.historicchevychasedc.org, in a few days' time. Some of you have been at prior events, and tonight we're using the webinar version of Zoom, not the meeting version. This means that we can accommodate more people, but it also means that your video and audio won't be functioning. And so, as we have in the past, we will take your questions in the chat box. And for those of you new to Zoom, the chat box is on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. If you scroll across it, you'll see a box labeled chat, and then you can type in your questions, and we will accumulate those as we go, and then at about 7:45, we will stop the discussion and address those questions. We did a run-through of this event a couple days ago, and we discovered that we had about 5 times as much content as we're going to have time this evening. So I'm hoping that we can move quickly, and we agreed that we would post on our website a set of additional resources for those of you who are interested and address the issues that we could not cover. As in our other events, what we're going to hear about tonight is history that's either been forgotten or in fact covered up, and fascinating aspects of both the Marquis de Lafayette and George Washington and their connection to this neighborhood and this school in the 20th century. Before I hand the screen over to our moderator, I wanted to thank those of you who took the time to make a voluntary contribution as you registered. That support's incredibly helpful to our overall effort at Historic Chevy Chase DC, but it also helps us address our expanded technology costs as we move into the era of Zoom. So let me ask Carl Lankowski, Julien and Reba Carruth to please turn on your microphones and your videos. Carl will be leading the discussion tonight, and he will introduce our guest, and I'm going to fade into the background. And with all of you, listen with rapt attention. Thank you so much to Carl, Reba, and Julien for your time tonight. Carl, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Chaz, and good evening, everyone. We're gathered here this evening to talk about the Marquis de Lafayette, the namesake of our neighborhood elementary school and adjacent park in Chevy Chase, DC. I'd like to call this event tonight Beginning Again, inspired by Professor Eddie Glaudy's new book on James Baldwin, Begin Again. Glaudy and Baldwin bring us close to our subject in more ways than one. We find ourselves in another necessary reckoning with the foundational contradiction of the American polity between the promise of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution legalizing slavery that issued from the convention in Philadelphia 11 years later. Although the slaves were formally emancipated 77 years after that, we have never outgrown the psychic damage of this false start. There have been efforts to begin again. Reconstruction after the Civil War was one such. The Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s was another. Many hoped that the election of an African-American president would herald a third attempt. Each time we have refused to turn that page of history. This is the broader context of our subject this evening. What could people have been thinking in the period between 1925 and 1930 in naming a school specifically built to accommodate its white children only after the Marquis de Lafayette, a hero of the American Revolution, aide-de-camp to General Washington. What were they thinking? Was this naming in line with Lafayette's thinking? Would he have approved? Over the past 2 years, the neighbors of Chevy Chase DC mobilized to have the name of a one-time enslaved man, George Pointer, attached to Lafayette in a rededication of the park and recreation center to honor and acknowledge this African American and his descendants who lived on the land taken to build the all-white school. And now, in our neighborhood, Pointer will be forever joined by hyphen to Lafayette. So is this a good thing, a bad thing, or neither? Like Lafayette, Pointer worked in close proximity to George Washington. In Pointer's case, on building the prototype of the C&O Canal, a project pointing to the creation of a continental economy, evoking a Hamiltonian vision at odds with the neo-feudal plantation system built on slave labor, entrenched in the southern states. Tonight, in examining Lafayette's and Washington's assessments of the American project, the spirit of George Pointer hovers like Banquo's ghost. And we're lucky indeed to have with us tonight 2 fine interlocutors to help us sort out these issues. James Baldwin's fame as one of America's most highly regarded commentators of race produced his first major works while living in France. Tonight, we have the Frenchman, Julien, who knows Lafayette as intimately as anyone could at bicentennial distance. A historian and geographer, Julien has devoted more years than it takes to write a dissertation on Lafayette and his 1824-1825 visit to the country that he helped found. He created the Lafayette Trail Project, I'm talking about Julien now, with which all of us should become familiar. More about that in a moment. We also have with us Dr. Reba Carruth, a sociologist by training with extensive experience in Europe and an active presence in transatlantic relations. Particularly significant for our topic tonight is Reba's role as a consultant to Mount Vernon, where she has developed expertise on George Washington and his world. So, let us start by asking Julien to tell us what inspired him to follow the Marquis de Lafayette to this side of the Atlantic and briefly describe the Lafayette Trail Project. Julien, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Carl. And I want to commend you as well, Chevy Chase Historical Society, for undertaking that amazing project. As the country revisits the legacy of the founding generation, I think it's great in the nation's capital that this conversation is happening at that scope. And I commend you in your efforts for that. It's fabulous. So we're honored at the Lafayette Trail to be a part of this, of course. And I'd like to share with the audience, welcome to everybody tonight. I hope you all are safe and sound in your house. And we're grateful that you're spending some time with us tonight. So I would like to just introduce the Lafayette Trail real quick before we start this very exciting Q&A session. So I'm just gonna go ahead and share my screen with you all. I'd just like to start with a couple things about what we do. Carl and Charles really briefly introduced what we do at the Lafayette Trail. We focus on the 4th and last visits of the Marquis de Lafayette in the country, in the United States. And basically, you know, you might be familiar with the legacy of Lafayette during the Revolutionary War, but maybe fewer of you know that he actually came back in 1824 for the last time as the last major general still alive from the Continental Army. So one aspect of Lafayette that people should know more about, and of course it's very tied with the topic of tonight, race matters locally, is Lafayette's abolitionist legacy, in the sense that what he wanted for this nation was a civic contract, a civic society where unalienable rights would be granted for everybody, regardless of background. So we have established a partnership. We have entered into a an exclusive partnership with a foundation called the William G. Pomeroy Foundation, in which we are placing historic markers around the country to make Americans more aware of Lafayette's legacy. So we present a package, and by we, I mean the team at the Lafayette Trail and me personally as a Frenchman. The package as follows: that the Marquis de Lafayette in 2020 has an exclusive and great potential to unite Americans with a great story that actually can tap into the military, can tap into Native American history, African American history, Southerners, Northerners, unite everybody around the idea that this country is benefiting or should benefit everybody, regardless of background. So the markers are like this, as you can see, blue, white, and red, the colors of France and of the US. So I do would like to show you basically some of our resources. We have a map on our website. I'm gonna show you one of those that we have online. This map actually would show you everywhere in the country where a marker has been installed or will be installed in the future. We operate across 25 states, which is the entire amount of states that existed in 1824. And of course, that we are operating in, because we're placing those markers around 25 states. So this is one of our maps. I encourage you, of course, to go on the LafayetteTrail.org, our website, to see more about those resources and potentially engage with more of our contents online that I'm not going to have time, of course, tonight to go over entirely. So basically in 1824, in the few minutes that I have, I just want to show you that the country changes quite a lot. Okay, this is 1780. The population, as you can see, is along the East Coast. And if I slide all the way to 1830, you'll see several changes. Number one, the North is being industrialized and the life is organizing around those urban centers that are popping up. And you can see also compared to 1790, the role of the mid-Atlantic states is slower, it's less important. So you have the North versus the Southern economy that's, based on plantations. You see that divide that's actually going to lead to the Civil War 50 years or 30 years later, okay? And of course, the second point is the settlement of the West. So this is why Lafayette's tour matters. Actually, in 1824, he was this uniting figure that was able to bring Americans together regardless of political differences around the celebration of American history. So, I'd like to show you this real quick, that this is a map that shows you all the towns in the country named after Lafayette. There are plenty, 47 or more, and you can see that his legacy is actually national. We're going to talk about this in just a few minutes, I'm sure, just to show you this resource. So this is a timeline we have on our website that shows you, all the milestones in Lafayette's life, the dates. So they will show you what he did for this country to promote universal rights and his idea for the country. We do have those resources that are available on our website. And of course, we have many more. This is, for instance, one that we're going to talk about tonight, probably James Armistead Lafayette. This is one of, he was enslaved worker, actually enslaved in Yorktown in 1781 and got his freedom later on from Virginia. And he got a personal recommendation from Lafayette. So this is a primary source document that shows you basically how Lafayette committed to universal freedom. And of course, the District of Columbia, since we're going to talk about the nation's capital, how it ties into how the nation's capital was being shaped, and basically this question of slavery, abolitionism. Today, the District of Columbia does not have the Virginia part, which it had in 1824 when Lafayette was here. So as the nation develops, and how this question of slavery evolves, and people start talking about it or doing things about it or not, you see actually cities that are changing shapes or states that are taking policies or not. So I hope we have questions about that we can have answers about those questions that are complex tonight, and that I would be happy to talk a little more about. So we do have at the Lafayette Trail a publication in which we share all of our primary source data. And this is actually a benefit for our members that I encourage you, of course, if you want to learn more about what we do, how we operate in the nation's capital, but also around the country, to learn more about our organization and potentially join us if you have an interest in being part of this conversation as we try to build this momentum going forward toward the bicentennial celebrations of Lafayette's tour in 2024. So to become a member, it's very simple. You go on our website, thelafayettetrail.org, and you basically go to the area that says login membership, and then you become a member. I also would like to point out our social media resources. We share a lot on those as well: Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you have a moment, of course, please share those as well. This is a brief overview of the Lafayette Trail, and I just look forward to the conversation that's going to take place momentarily. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julien. Let me try to concretize Lafayette's ghost with respect to the issues that we're dealing with here locally. And we talked about the fact that the school that was named for him here during the Jim Crow era in DC was, of course, for whites only. From what you said, it appears likely that the naming of the elementary school may have been motivated by the centennial of Lafayette's farewell tour. Do you think that's likely?
Yeah, I would agree with that, actually. I mean, I would say two things to that point. Number one, you see in this country, especially from the 1880s all the way to the 1920s, you see a movement that's local, and that happens all across this country at the same time. A movement in local communities to start writing about their history. So one of the side effects of Lafayette's tour in 1825 is that it generates an interest in historical preservation. You know, we, the United States, we're going to fly as a nation. It's going to work. We're going to make it happen. And we need to write about our founding period, the Revolutionary War. So that movement started to be very serious during or in the wake of Lafayette's tour. You have like historical societies like the Pennsylvania one or the Connecticut one that were chartered in 1824-25 as a direct or indirect consequence of Lafayette's tour. But later on, for the centennial of the American independence, basically, and it started in the 1870s and all the way, if you want, to the 1920s, people wrote about their town's history. And if you go online and if you look at all those towns' histories, I mean, there's a very good likelihood that all those books are going to be somewhere between 1880 and 1920. Now, as it pertains to the naming of the school, what I would argue here is that we have the same effect going on in the 1920s with the centennial of Lafayette's visit going on. So Lafayette, as you know, in Washington, D.C., has a square named after him, which was named after him in 1824 during the tour. So he has a local impact. He's celebrated already locally in Washington, D.C. And the idea is that 100 years later, when you want to celebrate, you have this moment, okay, of visibility because of the centennial of Lafayette's tour. He's naturally an icon of American history because of the tour of 1824. So naturally, his name would be around if you want to name at a period that has specific, I would say, energy toward historic preservation or reference to the past. It makes sense that somebody would have thought of Lafayette because he was in the national collective awareness at the time because of the timing, of course, of the centennial of the tour. Now, what I found interesting is that, as you pointed out, this would be a school for whites only, and it just so totally opposed to what Lafayette stood for, in the sense that that seems totally out of question. And the fact that this school was named after Lafayette, to me, provides an opportunity to tell a story and to give more importance to figures like Mr. Pointer and the whole neighborhood history that were forgotten by history and its writers. So it's important that we have that effort and that conversation locally in Washington, D.C. today, because if we want to move forward as a nation altogether, I think we have to acknowledge everybody's contribution to the best of our ability. And that's only what we try to do at the Lafayette Trail.
Yeah, thanks, Julien. I actually wanted to follow up a bit with that. There's this question of whether or not the naming was a case of mistaken identity.
Right.
In that regard, right? You're making the argument that Lafayette would not have been pleased by this. On the other hand, we could point to other facets. I'm referring now to La Belle Gabrielle, the plantation, right, that he bought in French Guiana on the Atlantic coast. Can you tell us something about that?
Absolutely. So we know for a fact that the Marquis de Lafayette, General Lafayette, confronted the founding fathers as early as 1783. This is the earliest evidence, primary source evidence that we have, that he actually had conversations with founding fathers, other like George Washington. So we have this letter that he wrote from Cadiz, Spain, to George Washington, asking if there would be an interest on Washington's side to explore that venture to create a revolutionary model of a plantation in which it could be demonstrated that slavery would not be necessary to ensure the sustainability of the model. So that answer, that response, he did not get a positive response when they get a response at all, actually, from George Washington. And General Lafayette moved ahead by himself and created this revolutionary model plantation in French Guiana with the help of his wife, Adrienne. So this started around 1785, okay? And the idea was to basically connect work with reward, whether it's education or money. And the idea would be to ensure insertion into society, full and successful insertion, not short term of the former enslaved workers, but ensure the full insertion into society afterward. So that was the idea. He wanted to make sure that this model could be shown to the founding fathers and potentially implemented in the United States. Of course, in the meantime, the French Revolution happened and the plans of Lafayette in South America totally collapsed. And but we do have that source, that the map or papers showing the operation of the plantation. So that actually exists. And I think it's a source of inspiration that people like Lafayette, as early in the 1780s, try to do something about that question, which still haunts this country 20 years later. And I think I look back at what he did, and when I give talks around the nation, I always emphasize that connection with early American history, because people want to hear that abolitionism is as old as the country itself. It's not a later addition. And people like Lafayette really are the epitome of this.
I mean, I wanted to follow up just one more time
Sure.
before bringing Dr. Carruth into the conversation with regard to the staying power of Lafayette's commitment to universal human rights.
Right.
And I mean, tell us about how persistent that was. He lived until 1834.
Right.
Present through, I think, 5 regime changes, starting with the revolution in '89, the Republic, the Directory, Napoleon, the First Restoration, the Second Restoration,
and the July Monarchy later on. Yes, I mean the Revolution. So, what is your question exactly about which?
Yeah, just what kind of a voice was he during all this period, and what was he doing? I mean, how persistent was his commitment to abolition?
Well, it was totally consistent. I mean, from, as I said, I mean, Lafayette, see, when he came to America, there are several schools to interpret why he came to this country, but the one I actually push forward and I agree with is that very early in his life, he was introduced to the ideals of the Enlightenment through the Freemasonry, for instance, which would have guided some of his actions, most of his actions, and certainly the need to secure a political system in North America where individuals would be guaranteed to have unalienable rights that would be protected under the law. So in other words, it's what you say, when you hear today, country of law, the United States, that's what it means. And from very early in his life, Lafayette had that care for universal rights. He wanted for the United States to survive and thrive. For him, it would take to guarantee, regardless of background, universal rights. And as I said in my quick slide about abolitionism, there are milestones throughout his life that show you that this commitment was unequivocal. It was nonstop. And actually, it goes beyond abolitionism. Of course, it encompasses and it's a big part of it. But it's also about giving a voice to the Native Americans as well in the United States political regime. It's also about the Protestants in Europe. It's about basically minorities and making sure that the definition of a minority is actually compatible with having the same rights as everybody else. So this is a big question. We still haven't resolved that today. But the idea is that with Lafayette, we can look back at this era of the country and find hope in that people like him, as close to being founding fathers, thought of those and did things very early in the history of this country to solve that issue. And certainly, if they didn't solve it fully, of course, contribute to it and give us basis so that we in 2020 can take over and build up on what they left behind. I think it's important that the process is organic and it starts with the Revolutionary War and actually before then, all the way to today. And we try to provide answers to those complex questions.
Thanks, Julien. I wanted to bring Dr. Carruth into this conversation at this point. It's impossible to talk about Lafayette without talking about Washington, just as I would argue it's impossible to talk about Washington without Lafayette. They were more or less politically joined at the hip. They had a kind of father-son relationship. Lafayette was only 19 years old when he showed up in 1777 with the honorary rank of Major General in the Continental Army. Because of his connections at court in Paris and the notoriety of his family. But what about George Washington? He was a slave owner. How was he thinking about the trajectory of a new republic, and how did he respond to Lafayette's position on slavery? What does his appointment of Alexander Hamilton as the first Treasury Secretary and Washington's sponsorship of infrastructure projects like the one George Poynter was involved in tell us about the vision, his vision for the United States? What can you tell us about that, Reva?
Well, thank you so much for having me with you tonight. Wow, those are several meetings in one. But just very quickly, before we open it up to the guests, I think this is a very important aspect of American and transatlantic history that really has, to a certain extent, been erased. And for a lot of different reasons now has come back to the forefront, not just because of what's going on in the country, but what has occurred in the world since the time of George Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette. So the situation is as follows. George Washington is descended directly from King John, the king responsible for the Magna Carta. He finds himself, his family finds himself here in the colony. They are loyal to the crown, and he's the vestryman in his Anglican church. So morally, we do know that even though he doesn't express it publicly, that there is some discomfort with slavery, but they're born into a world where enslaved African labor is legal among all the European powers. Again, it's the wealth of these empires is based on extraction. The indigenous people initially are important in terms of trade and giving access to territory, but then they want the Europeans to go home. They die off from contact. The Spanish and the Portuguese have these relations with some of the kingdoms in Africa, and this becomes part of a trade, among other things. This trade in enslaved, captured people who are sent here to extract. Now, one thing I want to make clear is that George Washington sat on the House of Burgesses. He's not interested in destroying this legacy that has been created in part by his grandfather and the British Empire and the king. But he sees slavery not just as being morally uncomfortable, but as economically inefficient. That efficiency, financial aspect of it is something that becomes part of the mix. The one thing that is very important also to know is that George Washington and the other founding fathers are looking to Europe for insight and inspiration. You know, part of the myth is that the revolution was to sever all ties and connection with Europe and the ancient regime and so on and so forth. That's not true. George Washington is doing a lot of research on new technologies and innovations, and he's bringing over skilled European tradesmen to Mount Vernon and requiring that they train the enslaved workers to do the exact same skilled trade. But what is important to know is he's doing this under the radar, because this is such a volatile issue, this issue of enslaved people, because not only is George Washington troubled about it, but the other founding fathers are troubled about it. Now, Julien, you're in Yorktown. You're close to the museum, the Yorktown Revolutionary War Museum. There is an exhibition there with the drafts for the Declaration of Independence. One of the most incendiary documents that was kept out was the damnation, quite frankly, of the English by Henry Lee and Thomas Jefferson over the issue of slavery. Right? Now, I can't imagine going to war with a power and being told that this is something that's so incendiary that you have to take it out. But what it shows is that really the question is not whether or not they knew this was wrong or felt this was wrong. But again, in many respects, the dilemma for them is that this magnificent revolution begins to go in a direction in many respects because of Washington and Lafayette, which take it out of just the sheer contest for power and control over their own wealth and resources here versus what the crown wants, to something that is being driven by these higher principles coming from the Enlightenment, also coming from antiquity, but also coming from the Old and the New Testament. And I think the one thing before we open it up that is important to know, you mentioned that George Washington doesn't answer Lafayette, but in fact, he gets the letter and he tells Lafayette, we'll discuss this in person. Because letters can take on life. Anything that is written can get out of your hands and get into someone else's hands. And then he has a bigger problem. Because remember, he's the one at Mount Vernon that sees the enslaved people as people, right? They're not, you know, as enslaved people, you have no right to marry. You are livestock. Marriages also complicate things. You know, you don't want slaves knowing about the Bible. You certainly don't want them knowing about the Old Testament because you've got the chapter of Exodus there, and you don't want them knowing about the New Testament. So George Washington is in this dilemma where he's relying on these enslaved people. He needs more and more efficiency from them, and he's facing massive slave rebellion at a time when he's also breaking ranks, not just in his view that they are people, but also because he's relying on them to win this Revolutionary War. Something like 1 out of 13 soldiers in the Revolutionary War are free Black men. And it's his enslaved valet, William Lee, who is also part of the Mount Vernon group of enslaved workers, that we believe is the one who convinces him that not only are they losing this war, but he can't win it unless he allows them to fight. Now imagine that. Having to argue to give weapons to men that were enslaved. You could just imagine you know, he already knows, he's arguing, I can't do this, you know, I don't want the British to do it. He throws that into the mix. He doesn't want the British to do it, but the British are recruiting free and enslaved Black people and native tribes and poor white farmers to help them put down this rebellion. Only 30% of the people are with Washington, and it's these Southern colonies really that, again, have the resources because of the enslaved labor to be able to get goods that are being embargoed by the British, you know? So I think as we open this up, the one thing that's important to know is that it's not that he's not listening to Lafayette, but for George Washington, everything has to be set in terms of where we are. He can't lose the North, he can't lose the South. He's respected in the North, he's respected in the South. He's the one that recognizes that he can lose, or we can lose the whole thing after the Revolutionary War, unless every word is chosen. And the reason why, Carl, the decision is to keep slavery is to preserve the ability to create union. The Southern states threaten to walk out. They say they know slavery is wrong. Again, there's no question in their mind that it's wrong. They are going to free the slaves, but not just yet. In the meantime, where's the presidency? The presidency is in Philadelphia, and they've taken the decision to basically let enslaved people that have been residents for 6 months straight just sign themselves out. And George Washington feels these people are basically dangerous because he's getting it from both sides. He knows they're protected under his protection as their owners. But the minute they walk down the road here in Virginia, they can be re-enslaved and set someplace worse. So, I mean, for him, it's a constant struggle. And I think one more thing before we open this up, one of the enslaved people, Ona Judge, is a young mixed race woman at Mount Vernon who goes to the presidential household in Philadelphia. She becomes Martha Washington's lady in waiting. And Martha Washington says she sees her as a daughter. She's given the best clothing, best food, tickets to the circus, anything any woman, Black, white, or Native American could want. But then she finds out that George Washington has to circulate her and the other enslaved workers back to Virginia to break their residency. So they can't apply for this walk off your job and get your freedom process. And also she finds out she's going to be given away as a wedding present to her granddaughter. She decides she can't do that. So she escapes. She's aided by the governor of New Hampshire in this escape. Martha Washington is beside herself, will not accept any substitution. George Washington says he can handle it. But what is he trying to handle? What he's trying to handle is really the explosion that comes from the first president of the United States pursuing an escaped slave woman from the presidential household. And again, it's about these lives that are bound together, which is the name of this wonderful exhibition at Mount Vernon. I'm just a history interpreter there. I'm not a consultant, but I do get into the nooks and crannies and the process of learning more about these relationships. And I think, again, what is really important to know is that Lafayette is really a moral voice for George Washington, who himself is seen by the other founding fathers as their moral voice in a way. So that's very important to keep in mind going forward.
Let me come back to you and attack this from a slightly different angle as well, and contextualize it with respect to what is drawing a lot of local attention here in Chevy Chase, and that is the question of George Pointer. So I know you've been thinking about this because we've been talking about it, but can you contextualize Pointer for us in terms of what we're talking about this evening?
Yes, I'd be very happy to. One of the things that's happening is George Washington is away from Mount Vernon for most of his adult life, fighting wars, building the country. Again, as I said before, he really begins to see the capacity of the enslaved people more and more as they're helping him, not just at Mount Vernon, but in other roles around the country. He really, in many respects, wants to prove to himself that the way forward is to have this emancipation, which is strategically organized, and skilled labor is a major component of it. Having the enslaved people come out of these non-skilled roles to be paid for skilled labor, which is very fascinating. But when we get to Mr. Pointer, what do we have? We have a man, first of all, that's being leased. So George Washington, at a very personal level, is trying in his own way to state something that he can't state publicly until the end of his life. He initially says, I don't like slavery because it breaks up families. So he starts refraining from buying and selling slaves, even at a cost to himself. Then the other thing we see is that he sees that you have to evaluate each person based on their capacity and their character. And he's consistent with that, whether you're white, Black, or Native American. And Mr. Pointer is a leased slave. So you see, leasing slaves is another, I think, in a way, it's another mechanism to try to find a way to start shifting out of this. Because after all, if they're leased, they can go back to where they came from. You're not breaking up the family. But it's very clear he is impressed with Mr. Pointer. George Washington is not easy to work for, right? In the sense that nobody stays with George Washington for long periods of time as an employee, regardless of what your title is, regardless of what your position is. Look how long he retains Mr. Pointer in that role. Now, it is said, from what I read, that Mr. Pointer, as a young boy, he demonstrates obviously this very strong talent. George Washington can identify with it. He doesn't get to go to England and study like his half-brother Lawrence does. All of his life, he has a complex. So he really believes power comes from knowing things from the ground up. He admires people that overcome these sorts of challenges. I would not be surprised if George Washington didn't organize the purchase of this leased man, this leased enslaved man, to bring him on to work for him. The testimony to George Washington is a testimony to Mr. Pointer, and quite frankly, it's George Washington's attempt to wherever he can, however he can, to test what he and Lafayette know has to be done. Slavery has to end because it's tarnishing this revolution. Many people think it's the military part of the revolution that's important, or the fact that it was a colony that broke away. I still think this revolution is still going on. Universal emancipation, people being evaluated on the content of their character and performance, that is still the radical idea that is really very dramatic in America and in the world. But it's the ideal that really at this point is ready for the next level. So I would say that George Washington definitely listens to Lafayette. He respects Lafayette. But again, for him, it's important to survive, to fight another day. He feels if he, in many respects, we can look at George Washington and see if he loses the Union, then the rest of it is gone. What is creating this path for the freedom? It is this Declaration of Independence, which quite frankly, I don't think even some of the founding fathers fully understood in terms of scale and scope over time, the magnificence of this document. Even Frederick Douglass says this is just magnificent.
Thank you, Reba. Julien, I'm going to give you a chance to react in any way you want to what we've just heard. And of course, we're aiming to go over to Q&A in a couple of minutes. Originally, I was going to put the question to our two panelists. What should we conclude about George Poynter's pairing with Marquis de Lafayette in renaming the park where Poynter's descendants once lived, right? I was going to ask them. But it occurs to me on the spur of the moment that it's a question that we should be asking all of our attendees this evening. And if you have a chat box, and I invite all of you on the basis of what you heard or what you've read outside of this to register an opinion. What do you think about the pairing of Marquis de Lafayette and George Poynter? Let us know in the chat box. Julien, have you any reactions?
Yeah, well, two things. Number one, everybody understands why Reba is so successful as an interpreter at Mount Vernon. She does a wonderful job, and it's just a pleasure listening to you explain the earlier part, I would say, of creating the political union. What I would like to make a response about is when I did make a statement about this famous letter from 1783, and maybe a better way to put it is that maybe George Washington could not answer that inquiry at the time for the reasons that Reba elegantly laid out. Because you know, a point that we have to make also very often is that Lafayette enjoyed a certain like a vantage point from being an outsider. I would say he was not forging the Union from within in the sense that George Washington was, if that makes sense. As Reba said, George Washington had to shoulder many components to make sure that the political project behind the system in North America would thrive and survive. And maybe Lafayette didn't have to shoulder it as much. And that might have been, you know, that's a reason maybe why we can easily conclude that somebody like Lafayette could make such a staunch proposal as early as 1783, and that on the other side is, you know, people, I mean, the friend George Washington could not respond with a absolutely yes, let's get it done, let's get started right away. So I think it's important to emphasize that nuance, because yes, that connection between the two men, as Reba pointed out, is critical to understanding the contract for the nation, and at the same time that even though it's a political revolution, what's happening in North America at the time, it means in no way that it's breaking away for good from the ideological connection with the European continent. So that would be the 2 points I would make in response to what Reba just said.
Fascinating. Again, I was going to ask you to you know, state what you think about this coupling, but now I'm going to ask you to either do so in response to a question from the chat box, or to do it as a way of summarizing just before we sign off in about 15 minutes. So at this moment, let me ask, Chaz, I forgot, are you going to
Yeah,
moderate the question?
I've got a couple of questions that it will incorporate Gary Thompson's question and some others. Tim Hannipel noted that when Lafayette arrived in New York, there were 50,000 people to greet him. My question, Julien, is that true? And if so, our current president should be jealous. But leaving that aside.
Well, I forget the exact, well, did you ask a question though? Or do you want me, I'm sorry.
My question is, first of all, why did he make the tour and why did so many people turn out? He was an aged man. The war was 25 years earlier.
Right.
Or 50 years earlier.
So why did he do the tour and why was he so
Yeah.
successful? So the tour is a combination of parameters. It actually involves also domestic policies in France as well. But on the American side, there's several things. There's the fact that we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of the beginning of the Revolutionary War. And President James Monroe at the time is looking for a moment in North America to revive the revolutionary spirit. At a moment when a new generation of Americans is taking over the country, the government apparatus, you have people, new figures that are very popular in the 1820s, actually, like Andrew Jackson, that are popping up. And the idea is that by inviting the last surviving major general from that period, the friend of George Washington, again, how the friendship between Washington and Lafayette serves the national unity 50 years later, it's amazing. But that's actually the idea, is that Lafayette is the friend of Washington, the last major general still alive, going back to the United States to remind Americans of how important it is to secure and protect the achievements from the Revolutionary War. Now, on the other side, in French politics at the time, Lafayette also is in need to revitalize the liberal school of thought in France. And he's hoping to draw lessons from the American experiment that he could adapt or reproduce in France in order to give a new hope to, a republic with enhanced rights for the people of France. So you have just two dimensions that are that dovetail in the tour of Lafayette, and there are more, but those are big ones for sure. Now, when Lafayette travels around the country, actually, he very rarely spends more than 2 or 3 nights, especially in throughout the southern and western states at the same place, with the exception, of course, of Washington, D.C., where he spent the winter. But the point I'm making is the only place that actually has is an exception to that general accepted rule in his schedule is New Orleans. And the response to that is New Orleans, of course, has a major French background. And for Lafayette and his secretary, Levasseur, it was actually a very unique opportunity to see how people with French background adapt to being incorporated in an American system based on individual freedom and unalienable rights. So it was actually a source of information from Lafayette to spend time in Louisiana to see how people with French background in French, Louisiana, would fit in this American Union. So it's actually a very fascinating topic, the 1824, the era of good feelings at the very end, as it was called. And one last point I would make is in 1824, we have a very dividing presidential election in the United States, opposing 4 persons, Mr. Crawford, Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, and Henry Clay. And the country is very divided. So as Lafayette travels around the country, he's actually reminding people of what unites them together. And he's able to basically marginalize the political differences and instead put forward a celebration of the founding era. So it's very important to understand that whole context about Lafayette's tour, because you have these new Western states also that are being populated. And they want to show that they're as American as the rest of the state, especially, the older state, Virginia, on the East Coast. So Lafayette is this epitome, this living embodiment of the Revolutionary War that travels around the country and welcome the new states to the Union as being just as American as everywhere else.
And so when he was visiting all 27 states you mentioned, 24, he'd written this letter to George Washington that never went answered, but what was he saying in public? And was he saying it in all 24 states?
During the tour? Well, yeah, that's actually a very good question because, Reba made a point that George Washington had to had to always shoulder that the idea to secure the success of the political freedom, the political system. Now in 1824, when Lafayette is asked about those issues, especially slavery, he's got to be very careful because he's known as the nation's guest. Okay, he's the guest of the nation at the federal level, state, and community level. So especially in southern states, actually in particular, there will be time, especially, I mean, I could name towns or cities, I'm just not going to do it, but the idea is that some towns would actually, the mayor, I have a few examples, a mayor that does a public order prohibiting Black people from attending the receptions that are organized locally in honor of Lafayette. And he still wanted to spend time with African Americans at the time that public orders sought to keep away from the receptions. And by doing that, it was a gesture of sympathy and also a gesture that, you know, you have a voice. You're not, slavery is gonna end, and I'm giving you voice as the nation's guest, as the last surviving Major General, the friend of Washington. This idea that universal rights should be provided, of course, to everybody, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna give time to people. And by doing this, I'm actually at the same time able to send a subtle message while not offending my hosts. And that's very important because he always has, in 1824, he's the one that's in charge of keeping the nation together as he travels. So he has to be very careful, promoting an agenda in favor of universal rights, yes, of course, but at the same time, making sure that the states and the communities he visits don't feel alienated because he's too staunch or blunt on pushing an agenda at the time. So that's a tricky question, but obviously he did not accomplish everything, but he played that role in the tour. I wanted to point that out.
So I have two other questions for you then. So he spent a winter in Washington. Did he meet with the president when he was here?
Yes.
Did he meet with other leaders?
Many times, yeah, many times. I mean, he met with representatives, I mean, from South Carolina, from Maryland.
Do we know
He went to the House of Representatives.
he talked about the issue of human bondage?
Pardon?
Did he talk to them about slavery?
Well, privately, yes. Well, actually, he met with the former presidents, especially in Virginia at the time, you know, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison.
Mm-hmm.
So he has those conversations privately about slavery. And we also have letters about that, actually, that I'd be happy to share with the audience or people that ask me questions later on, potentially. So we do have those documents. He talks about it, of course, definitely. Now, in terms of addressing the National Assembly, for the reason I just pointed out, you would not find very aggressive references to ending slavery in his public speeches because of the worry that he had to maintain the country altogether. So it's about finding a balance again. But yes, he did have those gestures of sympathy and attention towards certain communities that local officials sometimes wanted to keep away from the celebrations.
When he got back to France, I presume he got back to France, but did he reflect on the impact of his trip or his impression of what was happening?
Yeah, definitely. So that was done through the book of his secretary, Mr. Levasseur, that was published in 1829. So that diary, personal diary, was made so that those lessons of Lafayette's tour could be shared with the French public. So originally, the primary source of Lafayette's tour was actually a French document, okay? Levasseur, which is the secretary, recorded everything. He published in French in 1829 and was translated a little later on in English. But that tells you that there was an idea behind the lessons that he would bring back from America. So it's all connected with what I was just saying about spending time in New Orleans and in Louisiana to see how the French would be compatible with being in the Union. So yes, there was a wish to revitalize the liberal school of thought in France at the time, returning from America. Yeah.
So I'm just looking at the other questions here.
Okay.
Got somebody who has an ancestor named Marquis Lafayette,
Okay.
who must have had parents who either met at a rally or knew of it.
Well, that could be many things. I mean, people like James Armistead Lafayette took Lafayette's name to honor his legacy or the personal friendship they had together. People take Lafayette's name sometimes in this country. I've met people that, you know, oh, I know somebody that has an ancestor that was known Lafayette. I mean, you hear so many stories. That's the thing with Lafayette. Everybody loves Lafayette so much that very often throughout my travels, I have to hear the story that, you know, my grandmother actually danced with Lafayette and they listened to this kind of music, and it was amazing. I'm not saying that some didn't happen, but there's definitely an excitement around Lafayette, and the fact that people named children after him, or, you know, got a middle name or whatever to honor him, I mean, speaks, I think, volume to his success and popularity in the United States at the time and still today.
Reba, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I will a little bit. In your study of Washington, is there any record of what he thought about this young Frenchman who came in, this young rich Frenchman who came to help fight the war? But I think Washington probably thought of more as access to French support.
Well, it's quite interesting that you asked that, because you know, what's very powerful is that, again, George Washington is English, even though he never went to England. He's, you know, we don't have an army, but, you know, the colonies are mobilized for the French and Indian War. But Washington, again, you know, he really is, he's a man that charts a different course. He says there are no permanent allies, which can also mean that the British are not our permanent allies, and you can change line. But he sees, he and Lafayette had a father-son relationship. And when he gives him the key to the Bastille prison, which is still on display at Mount Vernon in the mansion, the note to that Lafayette says, essentially says, for example, from a son to a father, just beautiful language, you know, I give you the key, I give this key to the father of all liberty. Which in a way, again, remember there's that Enlightenment line. George Washington is a Mason. He really, you know, keeps an eye on all these intellectual and philosophical lines and things. That's a very powerful statement. And there's a time when Lafayette's life is on the line in France. All right, where he really is, I mean, it could go either way, of being executed or not executed. Also, the other thing that's quite interesting, and maybe Julien, you could talk a little bit about that at some point. It's my understanding that initially the King of France rejects a request for an alliance because it doesn't look like we're going to win this war.
Right.
All right. I mean, let's be honest. You know, the Indian tribes that were allied to the Iroquois Confederation are told to stay neutral. They have these covenant chains of trade with the King of England. So they begin to migrate into actively supporting him and putting down this rebellion. You know, we're not trained as soldiers. You got second, third generation farmers who descended from people who fulfilled their indentured status. They're not interested in being torn up in these wars with these very sophisticated Hessian mercenaries who are just wiping us out. And so when this Frenchman comes, this very young Frenchman from one of the top French royal families comes with his own ships, all right? And remember, there are all these people circling Washington, offering their help as generals. He doesn't know whether these people are really there to help him,
well,
or they're being paid to really just sort of help accelerate, you know, capturing them. And as one English officer was quoted as saying, to bag the old fox. That's what George Washington was called, the old fox.
If I may just follow up on what you just said, because you asked if I could real quick, and I know we're running out of time, but what is also fascinating about the early Lafayette is that his personal commitment to American freedom precedes any official involvement from the French. And that's because in Europe, there's still, you know, the legacy from the 7 Years' War, which you call here the French and Indian War, that actually there are some treaties that still bind, you know, people cannot in France officially go out there and publicly defy British interests. So that's why Lafayette had to go rogue actually, and, you know, commission the ship and but sail away from Spain, not from French shore, but from Spain all the way to South Carolina. So it speaks also volume to his commitment to American freedom, that he had to go rogue originally to help Americans. And then of course, what eventually led to the French involvement is several skirmishes in North America that turned the good way, and that eventually brought the news in France that yes, those North Americans actually, as crazy as their idea sounds, they actually can pull it off. And I think, you know, we can join now because of the information we got, thanks to people like Lafayette that communicated or got involved originally, this can happen. So this is not, again, just one decision overnight. It's actually a process that started with people like Lafayette, but not just Lafayette, but that would be another conversation. But I just wanted to follow up with you on this very
Julien,
particular
thank
and important point.
you. Carl, you had a wrapping up question I think you were holding.
I do have a wrapping up question, but it's the one that I already posed before. I want everybody to vote. I want you to go to the chat box and state your opinion about, knowing what you know now, what should we conclude about George Pointer's pairing with Marquis de Lafayette in the renaming of the park where Pointer's descendants once lived? So that's the question. Do you think it's a good thing or not? And you'll be able to see the results of that because we will publish them in due course. I think we're out of time as well, aren't we?
Yeah, we are, and we accept no late ballots here, so vote now. But it is our a couple minutes past our appointed hour. I want to thank Julien and Reba Carruth for bringing your expertise to our space this evening, and Carl for not only organizing this, but moderating it. And thank all of you who have listened in for your attention. This has been recorded, and we will, after we clumsily try to process the tape, put it up on our website along with a list of resources to the extent that we've caught your attention with some of the, for me anyway, new, deeper visions of history I thought I knew. So with that, thank you to our panel and thank you to our audience, and good night. We'll see you at our next event.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a great evening.